Polygraph, the pudding's in-house data and visual storytelling agency. Her background is in computer science, journalism, and music, but she moved into clients of project management a few years into her career. She resides in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, and spends her free time on film pictures, clothes, running, and a K-pop group called Stray Kids. Please join me in welcoming. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to present, but I might come out of the presentation because we're playing up like a lot of things, but if anyone has trouble seeing it, you know, but we're going to spend a lot of time looking at this. Thank you for the introduction. I'm Caitlyn, and I'm the studio director of Polygraph, a studio that's attached to the publication called The Pudding. I know a lot of you all probably know The Pudding. We're going to spend a lot of time today, but I did want to introduce Polygraph as well. I started The Pudding, but I got really excited about the work that we were doing on Polygraph, so I actually transitioned it over there in 2019. But as I said, the two are actually connected. A lot of people don't know this on the outside. So Polygraph is our, as I said, our data journalism agency within The Pudding, and The Pudding is our digital publication. So I'm going to explain a little bit like the business model, how we make money for a second, and then we're going to have on like projects and stuff. But if you go on The Pudding, there's no subscriptions, there's no page clicks, everything is free and open. Not only our content, but also like behind our content, you can go through our GitHub and look at our data and our code and really explore deep. But we are for profit. We're not like a nonprofit entity. So to keep the lights on and actually pay the people that work at The Pudding, we run Polygraph. Obviously, we could have done ads, we could have done subscriptions. We do have a small Patreon, but we actually decided to set it up like this so we could give The Pudding as much independence as possible, which you'll see is kind of like a theme throughout our work. I would say we're a pretty unique setup, and we're going to talk a little bit about how we choose stories, about how they're very author driven as opposed to being signed by an editor, like you would think in a traditional newsroom. And that's kind of facilitated by this business model that's separated off into Polygraph. None of our clients at Polygraph, and I'm going to go through some of our clients, really ever intersect with The Pudding. So a good example is YouTube is like our biggest client at Polygraph. But we've done stories about YouTube on The Pudding, and we're allowed to because it's like a journalistic publication. Client doesn't mind. So that's kind of how the separation works in action. As you all might know, and we're going to talk about a lot of different stories today, whether it's The Pudding, whether it's Polygraph, what we do is essentially turning data into gorgeous visual content. To talk a little bit about the history, we were just talking that people actually think that people usually think that The Pudding started first, but it was actually Polygraph. Matt Daniels, who we're going to talk about the team a little bit, started Polygraph in 2015. He was doing kind of like really cool projects for Spotify, for Converse, for Kickstarter. Then by 2017, our back catalog of publications started to grow. And that's when we actually put in Polygraph. The two, but the team is actually the same. So even though we're a very we've been recognized awards, we've been nominated for Emmys, the data journalism, news design, we actually did some body excited. So it's really cool that we independently, there's 7 of us, right? We can recognize other journalists. Yeah. So I want to talk about a little bit because I think so everyone
like, oh, I don't know if you guys know that, but like, all like just fine. It's like you.
Designer, but we're also selling. So kind of go into and I'll talk a little bit more like that. But elegance and strategy, like level psychology research. Kevin has philosophy. Michelle and Russell have maybe the most traditional computer science background, but Michelle was doing software engineering and Russell was doing interactive media. Jan also did work in newsrooms, but she was doing like exclusively design in her degree. which I think is really interesting. Matt, who started everything, actually is just a degree in business. He did consulting for 10 years, like big business, suit and tie consulting. And then my background is in computer science and music journalism. My undergraduate is in computer science. My dissertation for my undergraduate degree was on data journalism and essentially trying to encompass what the pudding was doing. That's back in like 2016, 2017. And then I was working professionally in music journalism at the time. So I worked at music magazines, and that's actually how I came across a lot of Matt's work. If a lot of you know some of the work of the pudding, a lot of it's based on music. So I stumbled across one of his articles. And then my master's is in data visualization analytics from Parsons, actually, down the road. So that's kind of our team's background. And I think it kind of shows how a variety of different perspectives come to play in the work. And I think you'll see that in our portfolio. But I think all of us, what we started to do on our own was build up portfolios, work on projects. And that was kind of like the most important thing when we were having people apply to the team, is we would look at their portfolio and the projects that they've worked on a little bit more than necessarily where they went to school and what their degree was, things like that. So I'm going to focus on the pudding a little bit first, and then we're going to go into Polygraph as well. So at the pudding, we have a rubric when we are trying to choose a story. So if you think of, and I think this is probably the biggest difference between like the graphics newsroom at the New York Times or the Guardian or the Financial Times and things like that, is that we are strictly author first. So there's no editor, there's no anything assigning everyone's stories. We are author first. So our authors actually choose the stories that they want to work on. And as I said, we're an independent publication. No one else owns us. We own ourselves. We're not like owned by Google. But there's 3 pieces of our rubric for how we actually select the story. So the first is that we want an idea that's worthy of public discourse. And the easiest way to kind of encompass this is that I try to think about it if I'm sitting with my friends at a bar on a Friday night, could we actually have a conversation about this, regardless of the data, regardless of the visual and things like that. We really focus on what's the question, what's the story, could people actually have a conversation about this for 20 minutes? We also want there to be actually a deeper truth that the data and the visual is revealing, even if it's buried deeper into the essay. And of course, we're showing and not telling. Plenty of stories are probably better suited for long form journalism and just written text. We want a story that actually is enhanced and told better using visuals. And I think another really interesting thing that's kind of captured here, but not necessarily, is that we don't do anything related to the news cycle, or what we call like the media echo chambers. So, you know, back in 2020, we were getting a lot of people asking us, will you do stuff about COVID and things like that? And we actually have done articles and stuff on COVID, but in the moment, we weren't doing anything necessarily related to the news that's happening. And that's the same with elections and anything else that could be happening. That's a little bit more like the New York Times and the Guardian. They're turning out things a lot quicker on deadline. That's how we select articles. I'm going to get a little bit into our process and actually how we take. But I want to kind of like talk about our content. We're going to spend a lot of
别
time
老动了 ，please，
having some fun.
干嘛呀？
We're going to get to Polygraph a little bit later, but a lot of my job has become essentially explaining what we do to people who aren't familiar with it. And what I found over the past few years is a really nice way to do it is to break it down into different types of things, like different types of formats. So that's what I've done here, especially since over time, the definition of a visual essay, which is essentially what we say the pudding publishes, has very much expanded over time, which you'll kind of see in this portfolio. And even to just talk a little bit kind of on that point of why I'm working with clients. I did originally start making articles for the pudding, but we figured even though the pudding doesn't have like an editor assigning articles, someone needed to kind of run the studio end of things. So now, as we said in the beginning, I'm mostly managing the work, project managing, working with our clients, setting the strategy for Polygraph, which again is our agency. So yeah, so that's kind of how I transitioned over there. But we'll focus on the pudding a little bit. So I broke it down into 10 different things that we do, which is a long list, but we do kind of like more straightforward data visualizations. We do articles that are more journalistic. We do things that are explainers. We do really fun explorables, games. I'm really excited to talk about the word game that we actually published this year. We've done audio tours, quizzes. I heard someone really likes the how bad is your streaming music interactive bot, which is arguably our most famous piece still to this day. We've done videos, namely in collaboration with Fox, we'll talk a little bit about. And we're getting, I would say, like, we just finished all of our annual planning for 2023. The thing we're most excited about is actually physical merch, which I think is really interesting because it's like transcending the screen of, you would think of us as an online publication, but how we can make data visualization and visual journalism tangible for people. So we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end. But yeah, let's dive into some fun stories. So I am going to escape. I think everyone might be able to see still, but we're gonna click into stuff and go to different tabs and things. But so we do actually publish very, very simple, just straightforward data visualization that still kind of speaks to the rubric that I had showed on the other slide. I think maybe one of the simplest things we've done is this article. I don't know if anyone's seen the SICON community, but one weekend Russell was like, I just want to see every time someone says cool in community, and created this chart. And then he created a quick cut of every time someone says cool in community. And if you watch the show, it's kind of like a prominent phrase in the show. So I bet a lot of people could talk, and it's split up by like the season, so you can see when it said more and when it said less. This is literally the entire article. He came back on Monday and he's like, look what I made. We're like, put it up. It's beautiful. So this is like an example of something very simple. I think took 4 days to do in total. And then we've also done some data visualizations that are a little bit more simpler, but are still kind of like in the form of articles. So we have this really, oh, thank you. No, it's okay. Nice, much better. So like I said in my bio, I really like K-pop. We have this really fun story about K-pop that mostly is actually data visualizations only done with the tool Flourish, which we'll talk about some tools at the end. I highly encourage people to use Flourish. And then we also have this really beautiful story that Russell just published about weather records in your city. So obviously it's geolocating us to New York, but this is actually just a series of charts and data visualizations, really not that much text at all. But it's like basically explaining different weather records in the city that you're in. And it's just almost like a little slideshow, but it still is kind of hitting on those rubric points of like a public discourse topic that people can talk about. I'll flip through a few more of these. I think it's really a beautiful piece. Many years in the running. We put this one down. We started it in 2018 and then put it down and picked it up again in 2022. So happens often with our pieces. So I would say, even though some of these are going to blend in a little bit, I think these are good examples of much more straightforward data visualizations with some story behind it. We also have longer form articles in different, much more of what you would imagine kind of like published in the New York Times or the Guardian. This is a really amazing piece that actually took a year to do, that was in collaboration with the Marshall Project and the Chicago Reporter. And Matt Daniels, it was cross-published among all those publications. And it was looking at different prosecution data in Chicago. And again, this is much more traditionally what you would see in a highly journalistic publication, utilizing data and visualization. And it's a really beautiful piece. And I think also like an example of something that was cross-published between a few different publications. And then I actually want to look at the upward mobility piece. This was a really personal story that we recently published on upward mobility. It was done by Aaron Williams. He's a freelancer. We'll talk about how we work with freelancers and staff, but I think the visuals were really amazing in this piece. And again, though, feels a little bit more something like the Washington Post would publish in format. Vertical, narrative, more of a traditional story structure. And also uses some beautiful visuals that aren't necessarily data, photos and things like that. You'll see illustrations are something that we rely on heavily at the pudding as well. So I would say that's the kind of like second format of what we do. We also do really fun explainers. This sesame allergies piece is maybe one of my favorite pieces we've ever published. It's talking about the hidden risk of sesame allergies. And basically Russell on our team had a baby who has really, really bad peanut allergies. And him and Michelle created a data set of how to think about food allergies, and also like from the perspective of a parent who has a child who has food allergies. And I think this was like an extremely creative way to explain this topic. It's like they made all these like illustrations and little pixel people by themselves. And they also made the data set on their own as well. It's really cute. That's why it's one of my favorite pieces. And it's not like they zeroed in on crackers. And what I think is really cool about this piece is that they didn't look at every cracker brand in the world. They chose a subset to talk about this kind of higher level topic about allergies. And they included like traditional interviews with like one of the premier allergy researchers in the US. They contacted and were able to interview her as well, which I think is really cool. And I'll just momentarily also show this more simple explainer. I think it's just beautiful. It was done mostly in Photoshop, and it's a visual history of every Jordans in the WNBA. We also have one for the NBA. And this was all done in Photoshop as like an example of like, yes, this is data, like a data set of every Jordan, but like you wouldn't necessarily think like numbers and analysis was done here. But I think like visually, it's one of our most gorgeous. This was done by Jan from start to finish. Okay, let's keep going. So we have I'm gonna go through this one a little bit quicker, but this is kind of the example of like an explorable project, which I think is cool. It's actually geolocating you again, so it's gonna give us New York, and it's gonna look at the most viewed song on YouTube in your locale. And you can kind of like go through this more vertical narrative, but you can also just like go in and explore and see and zoom in and look at the different towns, which I think is really cool. This is really story light. It's very, very simple, and we want people to just interact with it and play with it. And again, Matt kind of layered on this more vertical narrative this time, but you could actually just explore the map and have fun doing that. So I'm really excited to talk about this because this is kind of a newer thing we started to do, but we actually started to make games, which is really interesting, and games that are like collecting your own data and visualizing it back to you. So yes, this was kind of done in the Wordle craze last year. It's nothing like Wordle, but we did make our own word game called Words Against Strangers. And essentially you have like 3 different clues that you get every day, and you have to like think of as many words as possible, and you're like competing against people. We actually just did like a tournament of champions, like the higher scoring players got to play against each other. And I think this is a really, really, really interesting thing that's breaking the bounds of what we would think of like a publication, putting out a word game. But we did collect the data. You got a visualization of your data at the end. I'm terrible at this. I'm so bad at word games, and they always watch the behind the scenes of me trying to do it. They use me as a test subject, so bad. But we've done this a couple of times before. This is a really beautiful piece. I don't know if anyone's seen our Mexico City piece. It's gotten a lot of hype recently, but it's actually an audio visual tour, and the visual is all done with illustrations of Mexico City. And we've gotten a lot of feedback from people who have been to Mexico City, and it is very, very authentic. The sounds were actually recorded in Mexico City. The freelancer who worked on it walked around and recorded audio of different cities and different market or different places within the market there. And it's been really amazing to get feedback again from people who are from Mexico City, who have been there, and it feels very authentic. But the only data here is the audio, which I think is really interesting. Again, not necessarily traditional numbers and data. It's kind of thinking about information in a different way. Keep going. So we have done some quizzes, and kind of similar to how you would think about the game pieces. Part of this was really reflecting your data, but everything is like very concepted, like, but essentially we've done quizzes that have collected the data afterwards. So our most kind of famous piece about this was one identifying generational gaps in music. So people did a quiz, and they essentially had to name songs from different decades, and we collected basically their age, so we can compare people in certain age groups to see where they remembered songs from different generations. And then we actually created 3 different stories based off of that data, using that kind of as its own data set. So it's like we created the data set using the actual article itself, which I think is cool. This is a space, and you'll see this come up in Polygraph. We're very excited about video right now. I think everyone's excited about video, but essentially putting articles that we've been kind of going through and putting them down in a video format. We've done this mostly with Vox, actually. So we've done like cross collaborations with Vox. This one was nominated for an Emmy, which is really cool. That was one of the ones. And it essentially does exactly what a pudding article does, breaks down articles with different discourse, but in this video format. This one is about what happens after TikTok songs go viral, which I think is really interesting. And this is about male falsetto, and how male falsetto has become more prominent in music over the years, which I think is really, really cool. So I've already heard about the streaming piece a little bit. I would say out of our whole kind of like portfolio, the streaming piece was a weird one. And I've showed a lot of weird stuff so far. I would say it definitely kind of lives on its own island. I categorized it as like an interactive bot, but that's like using your data to interact with you a little bit. We did recently do a piece on emotion journaling, which I think is really interesting. And it has like a similar kind of personal experience throughout it. But the streaming piece, like I said, is the most popular piece we've ever done. And it essentially does exactly what Spotify on Wrap does. And it takes your data and essentially roasts you. So it looks at your top songs, your top artists. And we created a database in the background that basically made jokes based off of like your top artists and stuff. So everyone probably saw that shared if people are interested in diving a little bit deeper of how we did this, but this was by far a piece that went viral that we didn't necessarily anticipate. And then the last kind of section I want to talk about, like I said, is physical merch. We've started to take our articles from the screen and actually give them out to people. This was a really beautiful piece on how the game of spades is important in the African-American community. And it's all about spades and card decks. So we actually printed the article on card decks itself. And it really has this like beautiful kind of horizontal scroll as you're going throughout the piece. And then this was printed out. We actually just like printed a bunch of these and put some of the proceeds codes. So it's like, again, making a piece a little bit more tangible than just reading it online and actually bringing it home with you. So this is like a really good overview of our entire portfolio. And it kind of gives you a sense of, we're called the pudding, which I think kind of shows that we're pretty fun. The fact that we called it, it was a long time people were like, where do you work? I'm like, I work at the pudding. And they're like, what? But I think this kind of shows the breadth of the different type of work that we do. So now that I've kind of showed that, I'm gonna go back to slideshow mode and talk a little bit more about how we actually craft projects like this. Because even though the catalog of work that we've done is all over the place, there's actually a pretty consistent process throughout the whole thing. I'm gonna see if I can hide these. I think the one below it. Yeah, there you go. So there's a few different ways that we actually start with an idea. The first is one we've already kind of talked about, which is like a team member has an idea. We do a meeting every week called story time, which people kind of bring their very, very half-baked ideas to with the team. And we do exactly what it sounds like. We have story time and we talk about the idea and we get feedback in a really low pressure environment. It's not like you have to have it fully fleshed out or have data. But after that, you take kind of the idea and you go into some data exploration. You actually want to see if there's data, if it's kind of hitting those other rubric points of, are we actually revealing a deeper truth with this article? So that's kind of what happens at the beginning when a team member has an idea. And we're kind of just, like I said, picking up ideas in our daily life. We're not doing things related to the news cycle. So we want this to have like a long shelf life with what we're doing. We do actually often work with freelancers. We are a really small team, as you said. So we accept pitches all the time. And you also don't have to be like a journalist engineer. You don't have to be able to like do the piece from start to finish. We can get a pitch from someone who's maybe just a data analyst, or maybe they're just a designer, or they're a coder, or they just have a really cool idea, and we'll supplement the freelancer with skills from our team, which is really cool because the whole goal of like having this open pitch process is to tell as many diverse stories, give different people platforms to tell stories on the pudding. And then the last part, this is like when very occasionally Polygraph comes into play. We do have some clients where we do a lot of just straightforward editorial work with them. And if we get kind of like the green light from the editorial team, we usually make some adjustments to the content, but we'll take the article that we published at Polygraph with the client and put it on the pudding as well. Pretty rare. It happens a decent amount, mostly with we work with the Google News Initiative a lot, and that often happens. So then after we have an idea and we actually have fleshed it out, and we know it can be a thing, then we have to kind of go into the latter 3 steps. I would say, and you would think this bottom step is the hardest, I would say the top step is actually even harder. You could teach kind of someone to code and to do design, to do data work, but having a sense of trying to figure out a story, that's why we are storytellers at the end of the day with data, is not easy and very difficult. Then though, after you get past that difficult phase, we go into data design and code. Usually data is happening first. To get very technical, everyone on the team kind of has their own workflow that works for them. Some of us use Python and things like that. I used to use Python when I do data analysis, but a lot of people use R in their team. Also, things like Google Sheets and SQL and things like that are extremely powerful. So you don't necessarily need to know like a scripting language to be able to do data work. And then when we go into design, we're big Figma people. I don't know if people know what Figma is, but it's basically an open source Illustrator. We do all of our work in Figma. But like, if you look at Jan, she will mock up her entire article in Figma before coding. But if you look at people like Russell, who have a more traditional computer science background, he actually just does like paper and pencil sketch and then brings it into code as soon as possible. So basically what everyone's comfortable with. Like I showed you the Jordan piece, we did that in Photoshop. We use a lot of illustrators as well. But that's usually where the design is happening. And then we finally bring it into code. And I'm going to use this out because that's important. We do code everything JavaScript, HTML, CSS. We do, I'm sure everyone's maybe heard of D3, like data-driven documents created by my postdoc at the New York Times, who was doing a lot of the original data journalism, visual journalism work there. We still use D3. We, some people use React as a framework, Vue as I used to use Vue as a framework, but we've basically entirely as a team moved over to Svelte as a framework. So definitely suggest looking to Svelte if you're looking for a framework. It works really, really well with data like D3 and JavaScript and such. So we also have a lot of resources.
A little plug, we have a workshop on Friday on Svelte.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, we literally our entire site is like in Svelte now. So we also on that note have a lot of resources on our site as well. We have like a lot of blogs that talk about how we make these things. We have Russell has done a 50-hour live coding live stream of taking a article from start to finish that you can watch it. I'm the audience member. It's not fun sometimes, but we get through it. We have all of our talks, presentations, we've done podcasts. We do a yearly pudding cup. Yes, the pun is there, but we choose what we think is the best in data journalism every year. We have an FAQ, so definitely I would go and look at some of the resources on our site. And I was also just saying that everyone on the team also has, except me, because I'm doing Polygraph. But I would love to talk to everyone here, but everyone has open office hours now. So you can actually sign up and talk to different members of the team if you wanted to. So it's a little bit into our process. I do want to talk about Polygraph, considering that's my baby now, but I will pause and do kind of Q&A exclusively on the pudding. And then we can talk about Polygraph a little bit at the end. Or we keep going. It's up to you all. Does anyone have any questions so far?
What is like I know you've talked about a couple of different timelines for projects, like there's some that you said you started and you stopped.
Yes.
And the like 50-hour live coding
Yes.
project. But what would you say is like the average or like normal amount of time that your team spends from like the inception of the idea all the way through it being published on your site?
Yeah, definitely. I actually think that's an important question because even though the timelines have varied drastically based on the article, I would say there is a rule of thumb that if you're spending more than like 6 to 8 weeks on a single article, you might want to reevaluate where you are in the article. Because I think the type of work that we do, but I also think data work in general, particularly when you're working at with big data sets, you're on kind of like the edge of a rabbit hole a little bit, and you can find yourself falling down the rabbit hole and needing kind of outside perspective. So I would say 6 to 8 weeks is usually a good rule of thumb for what we think about as a traditional pudding article. I would also say that there's no one on the team only working on one article at once. Kind of how we set up the company. Usually people have one client project going and maybe 2 pudding projects at the same time, or 1 pudding project and maybe working with a couple freelancers. So would not say 6 to 8 weeks full time. But to your point, there's kind of been the life cycle, which I can talk about for a second. We've had articles we've started and had to kill kind of at different phases. Some of them were like done and we were like, we're not gonna publish this. It didn't work out. That's happened like maybe twice. We've had articles like the weather records. We were trying to do data work for that in 2018. We ended up having to put it down. In 2022, we found a data set for it and we were like, amazing, we can return to this article. I don't know if anyone knows, I actually didn't show it, but our Ali Wong stand-up piece is quite popular. And that was actually the first piece I worked on as an intern. But we collected all the data, put it down, and then picked it up a year later, and it became a different piece, so. But yeah, 6 to 8 weeks, I think is a good rule of thumb. What I tell clients usually is 10 weeks to factor in client nonsense back and forth and things like that. Is there other questions?
I was wondering if you envision incorporating ChatGPT or piece on it sometime?
Oh, I think we have. So we've done many AI pieces, and I think we've done ChatGPT actually back in the day. I can kind of send out, I actually almost made a section on AI pieces, and then I was like, there's already 10 sections. I can't make another section. At this point, I just have to say it's like a hodgepodge of stuff. But we've done like 2 to 3 AI recordals, and I'm pretty sure they're using ChatGPT. Going back to like, I think we're using it for AI at least, to try to win the New Yorker caption contest. I don't know if everyone knows what that is, but they put up like a cartoon and put a caption. We were having an AI bot submit every day. That was fun. We've done one about wine. I think that uses ChatGPT. Yeah, so we actually have done some work with it, and we'd be happy to send out some of our AI pieces afterwards. Also done pieces on like plain language, what it means to like algorithms in plain language, deep learning of like resumes and stuff. So we've done some more technical algorithm stuff as well.
I'll ask you a question on behalf of the students. You mentioned you started as an intern, so does the putting higher? What does that look like for students?
Yeah, I let that slip, but it's a good thing. I think actually, I did actually start in 2017 as Matt Daniels' intern apprentice for a summer. I like cold emailed him in March, and I was like, I love your piece on punk music. I love punk music, and I also code. And I went through the intern process and ended up hiring me. So that's actually how I started. I was still in my last year of school, so I had to go and finish school. And I did independent kind of contracting, and then was hired full-time. About 2 weeks before I graduated, I got a call from Matt, and I started working on putting work, but also, which we'll talk about Polygraph in a second, but on our YouTube contract that I referenced earlier, doing music trends analyst work. So it was like perfect combination of my background in music journalism and computer science. So that's how I was particularly hired. But to answer your question on how we do hiring, right now, we don't have like any full open positions, but there are many ways that you can work with us. We do accept, like I said, pitches all the time. So there's like a rubric on our site and a form you can fill out, and we respond to pitches basically on a weekly basis. The editorial team does. So that's one way. With Polygraph, and I can kind of add this to the slides afterwards, we work with contractors all the time. So basically, you can put in your information, say I'm a design expert, I love doing data analyst stuff, and we log you in our database. And when we have a need on client projects, we bring in people. I would say we hire every 2 to 3 years, so it is a pretty slow timeline, but we like to give opportunities for people to still work with us. We've been exploring internships, fellowships again. We almost started a school this year. So we are trying to like kind of build out more of like an educational program through putting as well, but yeah.
I have a quick question before you get to Polygraph, which is when you're going through the ideation phase on the pudding side of things, storytelling, how do you determine the best format for the data in terms of the kind of storytelling that you engage in?
Oh, I love that question. I know you have a question as well. But that's a really exciting question actually in the context of Polygraph as well, because I get clients asking me that all the time, and I have to like use my knowledge of the pudding and how we do it the pudding to kind of coach clients through what I think is like the best format for their data and for their story. So on the client end, and it does apply to the pudding a little bit, it does depend on the audience. So we'll get some pieces, we're working with policymakers on some pieces. We need something to be really quick and easy. It should be straightforward. We don't need anything fancy. The other end is maybe when we're working on a super creative marketing piece with consumers, then we're going to have it be really fun and interesting, like a Spotify Wrapped and things like that. So that kind of like on the client side, the audience kind of affects what format we're choosing, because we actually want to get the point across to certain audiences. And then there's also journalists and everything in between. On the pudding end, it really depends on the independent thinker themselves. And I will say, usually when they're thinking of an idea, they usually have a little bit of an idea of what they want the format to be. So when Matt was doing the Spotify Wrap, like Spotify, he knew he wanted it to be like a chat bot. But the really important part, to actually answer the question on the pudding side, is we do basically weekly rounds of review on every article that's happening. And so everyone on the team kind of coaches the person working on it to figure out what they think is the best one. So even though there's like one maker driving the piece, they get a lot of feedback from everyone on the team. And usually that helps shape the format afterwards. Our biggest kind of like internal principle is like working in public and getting feedback on your pieces. So I would say it's definitely depends on the individual author on the pudding. For Polygraph, totally depends on the audience and like what the client needs. So yeah.
That was kind of my question, but I was wondering, what are some of the challenges that are coming with like having the pudding, which is an online magazine, doing physical merch?
I love that question too, because I was pushing everyone to think about like, what if we weren't an online publication this year? Like, what if we were just like the pudding as an entity and we weren't kind of like, not confined, but we just didn't necessarily think of ourselves only as an online publication. So I think right now we're kind of just trying things and we're trying not to be too strict on it. Like, oh, we're an online publication, so we can't do a museum exhibit or physical merch. But I could see in the future us actually removing that label and just being a little bit more of like an entity that does data and visual storytelling. And we are a bit small. We're not like a big org, obviously. So I think we have the ability to do that. So it's interesting that you brought that up because we've been talking about that a lot as a team. I do think this work is getting a little bit more familiar with bigger audiences, which means that we need to innovate and experiment and kind of like stay at the front of it. So yeah.
What's kind of like your balance or like capacity of more traditional journalistic styles? Like, I thought the piece about Mexico City was really interesting because like, I assume the author of that piece like went to Mexico City and kind of collected data. So how often like are people kind of traveling or like interviewing, doing more traditional journalistic methods?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say it's getting a little bit smaller, kind of based on that last question about how we're being a little bit more experimental with the type of work we're doing. But I would say from like when it started in 2017 to around 2020, 2021, about 75% of the work kind of contained interviews, that original data collection, and a lot of that like traditional journalistic work, which is why kind of going back to the awards slide, we were really excited when we were recognized as like online small newsroom of the year, or online newsroom of the year, and things like that. So I would say now we're kind of less incorporating interviews and things like that, but I would say now it's like kind of going down to maybe 50%, less than 50% as time goes on. But yeah, definitely in those first few years, we were like 75% of integrating things like that. But we do create, like similar to the Mexico City piece, we do make a lot of data sets from scratch if data sets don't exist, which often happens, whether it's like actual data collection. One of my favorite stories is, I don't know if anyone's ever seen our women's pockets piece, where we actually like looked at the size of women's pockets compared to men's pockets. We actually went to stores and measured denim pockets in dressing rooms. No one got thrown out of stores, which is amazing to this day. Just taking mounds of jeans and measuring the pockets. So that's an example, kind of similar to the Mexico City piece, where we're actually going out and like collecting our own data. A lot of it's scraping. We have a series of Wikipedia data articles and things like that. So yeah.
All of you are not based in New York, right? So you all work, I assume, remotely, and so the pudding, I think, has been like that from the beginning. I'm not 100% sure.
Yep.
And so, you know, most other people are kind of moving into, you know, and still figuring out, I think, what working remotely looks like. And so what are some things they think work really well at the pudding?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite questions, because Matt has gotten me progressively interested in like organizational strategy over the years, and like how you actually build and run an independent company, almost regardless of discipline. So to your point, we have been remote since we started before the pandemic. We're in New York, LA, Oakland, San Antonio, Massachusetts, everywhere. I actually lived in Scotland for a year. So we've not literally everywhere, but international too. So basically we rely heavily on a small subset of tools. I've seen some remote companies use too many tools, like it's too much. We're very much Slack, Google Meet, And internally for our documentation, we use Notion. Externally, we use Google Drive for clients, which I actually like that separation of moving things from Notion to Google Drive for clients. So I think definitely simplicity of tools. I think there's like tools under the sun for everything now, and we just try to keep it really simple. And we have kind of like remote policies around when you can schedule meetings. Right now, I'm at a talk, I'm not at my computer, my calendar's updated, my Slack is updated, everyone knows where I am. But it's not easy. We've literally been iterating on it still to this day. But yeah, trying to think of like other remote things that we've done. We have remote budgets for people to like set up an office with a monitor and things. We have different like benefits and stuff like that. Flexible working hours along time zones. So I would say that we are, in terms of like how we set our company, pretty progressive in our policies and things like that, which I think creates a little bit more of a creative work environment. I think the last point there is interesting. You can see how creative the pudding is, and we make our own deadlines and everything. It's just authors working on stuff they want to do. Polygraph, because we're working with clients, is a much different environment. I don't know if anyone has experience working in an agency, but when you're working with clients, you have a project, you have a deadline, definitely different energy. So I would say having those two energies under one roof is probably the most difficult part of like setting up our company. So yeah, but I love being remote. I really, really do. I'm gonna talk a little bit about Polygraph. We're like 45 minutes in, so maybe spend like 15, 20 minutes and then get you more questions. But so Polygraph, essentially how we market ourselves, how we sell ourselves, is that we're an in-house visual journalism team for the client. So very similar to how we set up the pudding. Everyone's doing every step of the process. We do that with clients as well. It's a bit different than other agencies that do data visualization right now, because essentially other agencies usually have a designer or they have like a coder. We do every step of the process, and our working groups are very small. So it's like we're a newsroom within these clients, within these companies and things like that. So that's kind of like our unique way of marketing ourselves. We do a few different things. A lot of companies have a lot of research that they do. Usually it's in like boring PDFs and they want to make it more exciting, like a pudding article. We do also have like different companies that have data sets already and they want us to like make something beautiful with it. And then we've also done stuff that's like straightforward editorial collaborations, which we'll talk about a little as well. So that's usually the 3 different types of work that we're doing at Polygraph. Once again, we'll kind of quickly skim through some of this stuff, but we've done, I would say, even a wider array of different formats at Polygraph. I was just saying mostly because we have more resources. Client, again, the pudding's an independent publication. We're not Google or Universal Music Group. And so we're able to actually have more resources, whether it's technology, money, data, to make different pieces. But we've done some installation work, which is probably what I'm often most excited about. I was just saying, I think my favorite piece is if you go into UMG, which is the biggest record label in the world, Universal Music, you walk into their offices, there's like a 40-foot installation with the data visualization that we produce. And it's in New York and California and Sydney and London. And it's, I think, a beautiful, amazing piece that you wouldn't necessarily think the people behind the pudding have done. Also done stuff for the Smithsonian, which is really cool. I would say thing, once again, kind of, I said this with the pudding as well, that I'm most excited about right now is this data vids concept. Yes, it's supposed to be also a pun, data vids. But essentially it's a video series that we did for YouTube that was attached to the YouTube logo, where we broke down different trends on YouTube in like a very pudding-esque article format, but it was a video. We're super, super excited about that this year. We've also done like big interactive reports, like think about end of year reports you see from like Spotify and Twitter. We've done that kind of work.
I don't have that information in Denim.
I watched this one off. We created a publishing platform for Harvard, which I think is really cool. They basically wanted their own pudding. So they came to Polygraph and they're like, can you make a pudding but for us at Harvard to actually publish our research for people outside of the field of kind of like outside of academia. So that was really exciting. One of our longest clients is actually LinkedIn. As you can imagine, LinkedIn have a ton of data on jobs and skills, and they want to get that jobs and skills data to different policymakers. So essentially our clients at LinkedIn take our pieces that we make. Could have just been a report or a research report that they gave to a bunch of policymakers. Instead, they have us make interactive, like pudding-esque articles that they present to policymakers that break down the data to try to get policy change. We've also done some really random stuff, like podcast stuff with like Sirius XM, and that was like a tool for them to sell things. And I think and I'll talk about the end, we've also done like collaborations with Washington Post, which is really exciting. Some more traditional journalism, but just like through Polygraph. So yeah, I'm just gonna skim through some of the work that we've done at Polygraph. You can kind of see. Me? Oh, there we go. So this is the universal music piece that I was talking about. That's up in the offices at UMG. And the idea with it, I mean, I think you could do a lot of different, like, very straightforward data visualization, but the task that we were kind of given from UMG was that they did wanted to tell like a story about their artists and the global reach, particularly the global reach of their artists and data, which is why we really centered on this like main globe visualization. Again, I want to talk about the global reach of the data, so we chose the globe visualization. And it breaks it down for their top artists every day. So the data actually live updates every day. And the artists switch out based on like what are the top 100 artists at UMG that day. And the idea was literally like Taylor Swift walks in and sees her data on the screen. That was like the prompt essentially we were given. We wanted to feel very personal to them. I think it's cool. This is a piece that we did for Strava, much more traditional data visualization, as you can see, essentially breaks down running data, but it's like that very end of year report style that people do every year, whether it's again, Twitter. There's like some screenshots from the LinkedIn pieces, as I said, a little bit more traditional visual essays and data journalism, stuff like that. So I'm actually going to play one of the YouTube videos. So I can talk about for a second where this actually lives. So when you went to youtube.com and like Google Doodles, like they do different like Google Doodles. They were doing that for YouTube. They're still doing it this year where the logo would change. And you essentially clicked on the logo and you were brought to this video that explained the idea of what the doodle was. So I'm going to play it really quick.
Speedrunning is an effort in a video game to 2021 alone, it is a big part of gaming on YouTube. This video is our 60-second attempt to showcase the top games when it comes to speedrunning on YouTube. Based on views, the top game is Minecraft, where speedrunners take elements of the Minecraft campaign and give it a competitive endpoint. Rounding out the top three are Grand Theft Auto 5 and Roblox. About 25% of these games come from the 2000s and 15% come from the 90s. Many of these classics have a history of speedruns that span decades, which are meticulously documented by creators such as Summoning Salt and Carl Jobst. Now, if we take a look at the data from different countries, some interesting trends emerge. In Brazil, Sega outsold Nintendo for years, and unsurprisingly, speedruns of the original Sonic the Hedgehog and Sonic 2 sprung into the top 25 games based on views. Meanwhile, in India, Clash of Clans enters the top 5, one of the many mobile games to rank higher in the country. Speedrunning has even begun to transcend gaming. Creators now compete in speedrun challenges based on everyday apps like Duolingo and Wikipedia. The ongoing appeal of speedrunning is more than the thrill of chasing records. It's about players finding new ways to connect with beloved games and keep them relevant. In other words, it's not just about going fast, it's about making great games last.
I love these. I think they're so fun. We've done like 4 or 5 of them. I also think this is cool because it uses, again, sketchy illustrations to do the data.
Speedrunning is
So we've done one kind of like my baby. I haven't worked at YouTube Music for a while about the Billion Views Club as well, which I think is really cool. So every music video that's hit 1 billion views on YouTube, broke it down by genre, different artists. We've also done one on like breakout creators and things like that. I don't know why I was doing this, but we're gonna keep going. This is a little bit about the publishing platform we made for Harvard, which I think is really cool. Again, professors obviously have decades of research. They want to get it out to people who aren't in academia. And this was a way for them to kind of explain their research, explain their work, and kind of why it matters to the layperson, if you will. So not only did we actually create an article for them, but we created also like the CMS that was essentially doing this work and it all integrated data visualization and stuff like that. So it wasn't necessarily like a WordPress. It actually hosted different visualizations and things like that. We made this really cool kind of explorable universe of podcasts with Sirius XM. This was very producty. We usually don't do product work, but I thought this was quite cool. And then the last one I want to talk about is just a little bit about our Washington Post piece. And I think I might actually try to click on this, but this was a really amazing piece that was sponsored by Google News Initiative, and it was published on the Washington Post. And it basically was a video breakdown of the first week of protests after George Floyd's death in Minneapolis. And this was, I think, really cool because, again, it was working with a client through Polygraph, but it was doing very strictly a journalistic piece with, oh, it's not scrolling, but like a journalistic piece, obviously, the Washington Post, which is the biggest. There we go. So we collected all this data using YouTube Live and Facebook Live and basically explained. And I think not only is this beautiful because it's, again, like an editorial collaboration through Polygraph, but it also is using a different type of data, using video data to actually tell this story. It's not necessarily information that you would immediately think of. Now, let's see. So like I said, just wanted to bring you through a little bit of our client portfolio because I was saying earlier, I don't know if people necessarily see the business of data viz, how different clients want to work with data viz, obviously, and even data journalism. Obviously, it happens at our publication, but clients like YouTube and Google and LinkedIn want this kind of like data journalism, visual journalism work for their different marketing campaigns, things like that. So yeah, okay, I'm going to stop. I know we already did a round of questions, but if anyone has like more questions about Polygraph more or the pudding, let me know.
With alarm, like the general computer science background is very objective and like mostly conflict with data. So what's the need to move from one of graphic standpoint towards becoming more creative in the applications of computer science?
Yeah, definitely. I think like when I was talking about the backgrounds, it kind of shows how everyone's very multidisciplinary, but for at least me, Michelle, and Russell, who came from that much more like straightforward computer science degree background, I think all of us were doing things outside of our curriculum, outside of software engineering, that were in the creative space. So for me, while I was getting my degree in computer science, I was working all in newsrooms, working at magazines, doing as much creative work outside of my degree as possible. And then I was able to kind of merge it together for my dissertation, take the music, take the journalism, and merge it together with computer science. Russell actually did end up doing a master's in interactive media. So he did go the more like, I would say, academic approach to like bring in the creative, even though it was under computer science. He actually was like the graphics editor at the Boston Globe before he worked with us. He worked with documentarians, and then he kind of found his way to the pudding. And then Michelle, I think, is a really, really amazing story background. She was just doing software engineering. She went to Stanford for computer science. The way that she kind of got in our world is that she pitched us a story and she did a project with us as a freelancer, and Russell really, really wanted to hire her, and so we hired her. But I think, even though I think that's a really great story, what I that people, I think building up a portfolio of these creative coding projects, maybe outside of your degree, is really, really important. So that's essentially what Michelle did, is that she worked on a project outside of her day job that was very strictly objective, technical, like you were saying. So I would say exploring kind of pathways outside of the main thing. You know, I do drawing classes and photography, so a lot of things like out, a lot of members, Kevin's in a band, a lot of people do a lot of creative work out for day to day too, so.
You mentioned doing your master's at Parsons. Was it also, do you remember one of the first, like one of the, or a couple of the first few projects you ever did with data visualization after getting your computer science degree?
Yeah, definitely. So I was like part of the second or third data visualization master's class at Parsons, so it's still quite new. It was project-based. We had a studio kind of project after year one, and then a dissertation after year two. The classes, I actually were able to customize. So we did have classes like normal, but I was able to customize it around design since my undergrad was computer science. Some other people came to the program with a design background and did more technical, statistical computer science classes. So there actually was a little bit of like a customization of curriculum. I don't know if that's still the case. Again, it was still pretty early, so I had some flexibility to do that. So I would say a mix of project-based courses. I even got to take like, which I think is really cool, like fashion classes at Parsons and stuff outside of the data viz curriculum. which kind of goes back to the other question of different creative things. That's just technical. And then project wise, all my projects were about music. I grew up like loving indie music and stuff like that. So my undergraduate dissertation was talking about visually showing and like through data, the history of like a band. So you could like write an article about the history of a band. I was like, I want to take all of their data and show how they like rose to fame. And then another project I had done was also around music, but I looked at venue sizes of like artists playing different size venues and collected data on how they went from playing a small venue to a large venue to kind of show their growth in their career. I was very, very obsessed with like the successive musicians and how they got from kind of small to big essentially, and trying to characterize that with data. So that was an example of some projects I'd done. I'd done kind of fun projects for the pudding, one on The Office back in the day, the TV show. Collected all the dialogue from that. I don't know, but I was young. It was fun. But yeah, those are some projects I'd done.
I personally find what's daunting is like figuring out where to get the data from once you have an idea, or getting people to give it to you.
Yes.
So do you have any tips for how to navigate that? Or even like, if you have an idea, how do you go about creating a plan to get the information, whether you decide to go with creative?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say because of that reason, more often than not, we do create our own data set. And obviously that requires another technical hurdle, whether it's scraping, but it gives some more fun examples of people just going out and creating their own data set. So sometimes we just bypass that hurdle of asking people and we're like, you know what, we're just gonna make our own data set. So that's one kind of example. Also, I do want to call out that we're starting to do a little bit more is that like personal data set. So I showed very briefly the emotion wheel piece that was bringing through. Essentially, this person had journaled their emotions for 3 years, and we actually used a data set of just their journal of emotions. So again, we could have collected everyone's journal of emotions. It's impossible, but you get the premise. But we just decided to focus on one person. So sometimes it's when you're trying to tell a very specific story, you don't necessarily need all of the data out there. You can kind of like zero in on one story that's representative of the rest of the data. But so to kind of overcome that hurdle, we make our own data a lot of the time. But we have actually just like reached out to companies, and usually it's like their press email or the PR people. If you go on their website, they have like press at whatever, and we'll reach out to them and ask them for data. More traditional data sets like data.gov and things like that, they have like pre-done data sets. Even like for the weather records piece, I think we use the Weather Channel, like data sets and things. So I think cold emails like are scary, that people wouldn't want to necessarily give you the data, but we've sent a lot of cold emails and people have worked with us and give us data and stuff. So, but yeah, we do figure out data set all the time. I think I answered like half of the question. Was there another half of the question or? Okay, thank you. You're welcome. I mean, I'm gonna be honest, like 2 hours ago, I was like messaging people. I'm like, we're a mess, guys. How are we doing this right now? We're very casual with each other. I'm very, very lucky. Casual in a way that we're still coworkers, but Russell's like one of my closest friends. I visit him, his family all the time. So we definitely have like a vibe of, we are coworkers, but we also do see each other as friends, which is amazing. And I'm very, very grateful for. So there is definitely a very casual atmosphere, kind of just in vibe to answer your question. But we do actually subscribe to this policy, not policy, it's more of like conceptual framework called holacracy. Again, very interested in like organizational strategy, but holacracy is basically like a proposal environment. So anyone on the team, does not matter kind of like what your role is, you can propose a policy change. And the policy change has to come from attention. Like you have attention about something and you want to write a policy that changes that. And the policy essentially has to be passed if it's safe to try. And safe to try is like, it's not going to destroy the company or we're going to go into debt or something like that. So what that does, I think, is create a lot of agency. Again, it's a little bit meta because the pudding is very author first. We want authors to have agency in what they're doing. So we also don't have like a hierarchy in management or anything like that. We do have like a board of directors essentially that handle the budget and things like that. But there's no like bosses or managers and stuff. And we've had to, it's way harder than I'm making it sound. It's not people think, oh yeah, you don't have a boss, that's great. No, it's actually sometimes easier to have a boss, so. But it's created a much more open environment of people kind of feeling more honest that they can talk about how they're feeling. Have like a say in policy and things like that, so, yeah.
Kind of related to that, I'm curious to hear what the process is like. Do you guys have like internal crits for projects? Like what happens when, let's say somebody pitched a project and then, you know, you're going ahead with it. Maybe that person like does some work on it, but then does the rest of the team kind of sit down and talk about it? And how does that differ for the pudding versus the polygraph where clearly you have a client or other things to consider?
Yeah, definitely. On the and it's called work in progress. We actually have like designated time for it every week. And we have like different layers of feedback. It's kind of anecdotal, but you know, like the worst thing is when you're working on a project and you're almost done, and then someone comes in with feedback and it's kind of like rips up the entire project, and you're like, and you gave me that like 3 months ago when I was working on this. So we try to avoid that. So we have like different layers of feedback. At the end, it's very question driven. Like the author's coming with a very strict set of questions that you're supposed to answer. At the beginning, it's literally called like a dump feedback. Give me a doc of all of your thoughts. So we do like to refine it as it goes on, but there is actually designated time. Also, people do impromptu time, like anyone to come in an hour and do a work in progress on this article and stuff like that. People jump in and talk about it. We do have, like, right before publishing, everyone has to kind of give a thumbs up that an article can be published, which is a couple times in the past, articles have gotten a thumbs down from someone on the team. And that's a little bit of like a failure process. People weren't coming to work in progress enough and showing the work enough. So, but that's essentially how we do it. The pudding, it's a lot more loose and everyone just kind of showing work. At Polygraph, it's extremely strict because I've learned doing this type of very creative work with clients who are maybe not familiar with the type of work. You have to be very strict about kind of different levels of feedback at different times. We've absolutely had clients, like we've started coding something that we designed out with flat mock-ups, and then we started coding it and they're like, we don't like this. So, well, you actually approved this. We have to be very, very clear at different stages of like, we're gonna do full approval at this stage and also who is looking at it. So you can have like a higher up come in and once again, rip up the whole piece at the end. So it's much more structured at Polygraph, but it's the same spirit at the pudding of having people look at it at many stages as possible.
I have a question about like the relationship between Polygraph and the pudding. I mean, you write on the pudding about some of your clients in Polygraph. So what's the conversation and policies to protect journalistic independence and integrity? You want to write something critical, or would you not? Or is it, how has it influenced what goes on in the pudding?
Oh, we have, particularly about YouTube.
Okay.
But the way that we kind of get away with it sounds bad. We're not trying to get away with it, but essentially you kind of actually look at the two logos on the screen. If you came to both of these sites, you would not know that they were attached. I think the P, the alliteration between the two, is the only thing that connects them really on the outside. But that's supposed to reflect how the pudding is truly an independent entity and it acts differently than Polygraph. They're two different companies, two different entities. So if we publish something, which we have, like about, remember like the whole YouTube ecology craze a few years ago, all these people, we did a whole article on the pudding analyzing those. And of course, that was like directly connected to our largest client at Polygraph. Usually the only thing to maintain that journalistic integrity is that anyone that works on the client on the Polygraph side doesn't work on the article that's about that client or using data from that client.
So they don't get to do a thumbs down.
Yeah, exactly. They don't get to do a thumbs down. We have the nice thing is that kind of gets into some of the weeds with our clients is we've been working with some clients for like 8 or 9 years at Polygraph, and they truly love what we do at the pudding. So we're very, is again a little bit of a rare. We're very lucky that we can actually just call up some of our clients and say, hey, on the pudding end, we're gonna rickroll everyone with Rick Astley's video before it hits 1 billion views. Is that okay with you? And they're like, yeah, go for it. So there is a little bit of a casual relationship, but we don't, the most important thing is we want to maintain that journalistic integrity. So anyone working on that client's data at the pudding, and we don't like share data. I don't pull YouTube data and give it to someone at the pudding. That's like very illegal. So we don't do things like that. So presenting as different entities on the outside and also having different team members work on it are important.
Kind of going back to the question of background, but what advice would you give to people who have like a background in like more data analysis, but not necessarily computer science and coding?
Yeah, this is kind of a really straightforward answer, but I'm amazed at the free tools and courses that have come online. So I would absolutely pick up a course, try to, maybe that's like a kind of a cop-out answer, but sometimes I look at my computer science degree and I'm like, oh my God, there were so many courses I could have been doing at the same time that could have supplemented that. So I would definitely take advantage of so much of the online learning that's out there. And a lot of it is free and open source, like even looking at the 50-hour, which is, I wouldn't necessarily the 50-hour like coding session that Russell did. That's like an extreme example, but it does exist. So I would definitely say if I was going back to having like being a data analyst, I would 100%, but I wanted to pick up JavaScript, HTML, I would be doing courses. And I would also have a focus on building projects. Like you can learn the code and learn the theory, but something that Matt Daniels pushed me into very early on was just making projects. If it doesn't work out, if you don't know how to code everything, you'll figure it out through that. So I think having a project and supplementing it with an online course is probably the best way to pick up HTML, JavaScript, and things like that. So.
When you work with big companies like YouTube, for example, I'm assuming YouTube has like a team of designers and programmers. And so is there a lot of collaboration between the client, like Polygraph, and the people that work within the company, or is it more of the company just like dumping the data and saying like you can do whatever you want?
That's a really, really great question. And actually it depends. Sometimes like we'll just be contracted as an agency to take the project end to end, like you said. Just given a brief, build this project. We've done some work with YouTube like that. And we're lucky because we're super well versed in the YouTube data as well. So we can kind of operate on our own, particularly YouTube, because we've just been a client with them for so long. And we also work on a very specific team within YouTube. So we don't like change around teams. YouTube is like, as you can imagine, one of those companies where someone's on a team and they're like, there's probably another person at this company doing the exact same thing I'm doing. And I don't even know because it's so big. So we try to stick with smaller teams, but we do actually have sometimes which here's the brief, you're the agency, take it end to end. We've also had the flip side where we had to like collaborate with engineers and designers. It's very difficult. But usually it's kind of like collaborating with anyone else. It could be really easy or really hard. But we do have to code within their like code guidelines and approvals and things like that. But a really tangible example of collaborative piece is YouTube puts out, used to be YouTube Rewind. Now it's YouTube End of Year. And we pair with engineers on the YouTube side to actually develop the YouTube End of Year site. So they kind of use the unique expertise of Polygraph and the pudding and storytelling and integrate it with their eng team. So the short answer is definitely project by project. We've had both scenarios. I think the last thing on that, the videos that we do with YouTube, that was heavily scrutinized by their art team because there was already like the art for the Udall. So we had to basically get approval of the people who were doing the videos. They have to approve the design on the video, which is mostly a project management task and not fun. It's a lot of people. So yeah, that's a good question.
I just love the intersection of these two disciplines, right? Because we have journalism on the one hand and kind of computation on the other. But at the same time, there are also fields in which bias can introduce itself easily. So on the storytelling side, it's the bias of the person telling the story. On the computation side, data itself can be biased, and the way you select data can be biased. And if you have a subset of data, how do you know you're telling the whole story? So I'm just curious if you can talk about that a little more, even give an example of the kind of iterative process that you go through to check for that.
Yeah, definitely. So I think, again, I feel like this is way too straightforward of an answer, but it always goes back to transparency too with us. All of our methods are always published on every article at the bottom. All of our data is open on GitHub that people can go in, even like the data processing scripts, people can go and look at and see how we process the data. So I think the first thing is like being as open as possible right in the beginning about all of our methods of the data. There are scenarios which I find very interesting, going back to like having studied data journalism and a lot of these ideas of ethics that you were talking about back in college, in scenarios that you actually don't want to be transparent about data, just for like safety reasons and stuff. Like when I was an intern, created an abortion clinic data set, and that was one we did not publish for like safety reasons. So do you think there's like people like, yeah, put it up transparent, but you do have to have like a level of review that you should put up every data set that you make. But yeah, that's kind of step one. We're very transparent about it. And I think the scenarios where we choose a subset of data, usually personal data, to talk about a larger concept, that's kind of where the storytelling comes in from the computation, because the story is always presented in kind of that like pyramid way where we're starting with that personal story. So it's not like we're trying to talk about a larger concept with only one subset of data. We're usually like going in talking only about that subset of data. And as you get kind of down the piece, then you kind of have larger implications on. A great example is Matt did a piece on emo music once, and he was like looking at lyrics of a couple artists and then had this whole kind of expose at the end of how it was like representative of the industry and things like that. So, but that's kind of to your point, pairing computation, data analysis with traditional storytelling methods of like, I keep doing this because I learned like in journalism, like the first period and the pyramid of how you tell a story. So, yeah, I think it's how it's presented, whether it's like the transparency and then actually the flow of the story that you're making with the data as well. Yeah, the worst thing is to be like, this is all of the data. It's like everything about this topic, but you've only collected into the small subset of that. Yeah, no.
Sorry, I had to come late in class, so sorry if this is addressed already, but I feel like the pudding occupies a really unique space in data journalism where it's like not part of a traditional newsroom. You don't really publish stories that don't use data. And then your topics are a lot more creative and unique and don't always, and there's sometimes for more of a specific audience than like a broad trying to get like a lot of SEO or whatever. Like I'm sort of like, so it's like a unicorn in a way, like how is the pudding able to develop and like financially sustain itself? This like unique, more fun and quirky model of data journalism.
I'm glad you asked that question at the end, because I think it was like a nice summary of this in general. Like sometimes when I go into these talks, like it is very, even though we're signed up like kind of like the New York Times and the Guardian and things like that, we are in like set up like a traditional newsroom. We are very, very different. And I haven't really been able to find something like that. I really do think it is a unicorn. And so this goes a little bit into in the weeds of like creative companies and stuff, but Polygraph and the Pudding was founded by someone who had a degree in business and did consulting for 10 years. And you would think that someone with that very like business mindset doing that super, super creative work wouldn't make sense. But I'm every day so grateful that Matt was the person. He did have a business background that set this up because he was able to create a really stable foundation. I've seen just anecdotally so many creative companies set up by creatives, which creatives are amazing, but sometimes not the best with money in business. Sometimes they are. I'm not saying it's exclusive either way, but I've been always grateful that Matt had a bit, and people are always surprised the founder of the Pudding did consulting with like Amex for 10 years. And to even recap, so Polygraph is our studio, and all of our profit from our studio at Polygraph goes to sustain the Pudding. And the team works on both the Pudding and Polygraph projects. So that's how the business model is set up. But yeah, I'm always grateful that Matt set up the company in the way that he did, so it would be sustainable.
Any other questions?
So you said at the beginning that kind of timely news. What if an author does want to write about like a more pressing or immediate issue or like something that they feel is really like ethically important? Like, yeah.
I know this maybe sounds really bad, and maybe you all will have we actually decline it. We'll say no. We had a lot of people coming to us. Again, I used the example during COVID in like 2020, wanting to do pieces like that, and we directed them to the other outlets that were better suited to do that kind of more timely news work. Because not only we're part of the reason why we're saying no is that we don't feel like we're equipped to do work like that, and we don't want to not do it justice. So we got a lot of scenarios where people were tweeting at us, pitching us things individually, and we would direct them to, we had like a whole, basically, and then using the COVID example, particularly in 2020, like a whole Twitter thread that was like different places you can go, different work being done right now in this space. So yeah, we've actually ended up declining it in the past. But it doesn't happen as often because I think a lot of people kind of understand the Pudding kind of is not necessarily that. So I think we don't get as many pitches like that now.